It was just another Tuesday in suburban Boston, the kind of day where the air hangs heavy with humidity and the promise of an afternoon thunderstorm. I remember thinking how fitting the weather was for the tension brewing in our house. My mother-in-law, Cynthia, had invited herself over for lunch, again. These impromptu visits had become more frequent lately, each one leaving me with a knot in my stomach that took days to unravel. I stood in our kitchen, the heart of our modest colonial home, chopping vegetables for a salad. The rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the cutting board was oddly soothing, a stark contrast to the chaos I knew was coming. James, my husband of 5 years, was setting the table, his movements careful and deliberate. I could tell he was trying to avoid eye contact with me. "She'll be here any minute," he said, his voice unnaturally cheery. "Maybe this time it'll be different, Sarah. Maybe she'll be in a good mood." I didn't respond. We both knew that was wishful thinking. Cynthia's moods were as predictable as New England weather, which is to say, not at all. The doorbell rang, and James rushed to answer it, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Cynthia breezed in, her Hermes scarf trailing behind her like a banner of affluence. She air-kissed James on both cheeks before turning her critical gaze on me. "Sarah, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I do hope you've prepared something edible this time. Last month's lunch was, well, let's just say it was an experience." I bit my tongue, forcing a smile. "I've made your favorite salad, Cynthia. And there's a quiche in the oven." She sniffed the air dramatically. "Well, I suppose it smells acceptable. Now, where's the wine? You know I can't get through these little gatherings without a good Chardonnay." James hurried to pour her a glass, his eagerness to please his mother painfully obvious. We settled around the dining table, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Cynthia dominated the conversation, as usual, regaling us with tales of her latest charity gala and the shortcomings of her new housekeeper. I found myself zoning out, my mind wandering to happier times. I thought about when James and I first met at a Red Sox game, how we bonded over our shared love for the team and our mutual dislike of the Yankees. Those early days were filled with laughter and endless possibilities. Now, 5 years into our marriage, I often felt like I was drowning in a sea of expectations and disappointments. Cynthia's voice cut through my reverie. "Sarah, are you even listening? Honestly, it's no wonder you can't keep a decent job with that kind of attention span." I snapped back to the present, my cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger. "I'm sorry, Cynthia. What were you saying?" She rolled her eyes dramatically. "I was talking about Marjorie. You remember Marjorie, don't you? My dear friend from the country club?" I nodded, vaguely recalling a woman with too much plastic surgery and an even more artificial laugh. "Well," Cynthia continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, "Marjorie is relocating to Boston. She's had quite a rough go of it lately, poor dear. Nasty divorce, you know. She needs a fresh start." I made a non-committal noise, not sure where this was going but certain I wouldn't like it. "The thing is," Cynthia said, her eyes narrowing, "Marjorie needs a place to stay. Somewhere comfortable, somewhere familiar." The penny dropped, and I felt my stomach lurch. "Cynthia, you can't possibly mean this house would be perfect for her," Cynthia interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "It's not like you and James are using all this space. And really, it's the least you could do for family." I stared at her in disbelief, the tension in the room rising like steam from the forgotten quiche on the table. James sat silently in the corner, nervously sipping his drink. His laughter, though quiet and nervous, emerged from time to time like a weak attempt to defuse the situation, but it only made matters worse. "Cynthia," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "this is our home. James and I have worked hard for this. We can't just give it away." Her eyes flashed dangerously. "Can't. Or won't." I thought I raised James better than to marry someone so selfish. I felt my temper rising, years of pent-up frustration threatening to boil over. "This has nothing to do with selfishness. It's about boundaries and respect, something you seem to have very little understanding of." The room fell silent, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Cynthia, naturally. James cleared his throat awkwardly, but still said nothing in my defense. Cynthia's face hardened, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the tablecloth. "How dare you speak to me like that in my son's house? You ungrateful little witch. You're lucky we tolerate you in this family. Now you're going to ruin Marjorie's move." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "This conversation is over, Cynthia. I think it's time for you to leave." She rose to meet me, her face contorted with rage. "You don't get to dismiss me, you gold-digging tramp. James, are you going to let her speak to me this way?" We both turned to look at James, who seemed to shrink under our combined gaze. He raised his glass as if to toast, his voice trembling slightly. Now, ladies. Can't we all just get along?" His cowardice filled me with both anger and bewilderment. This was the man I had married, the man I thought would stand by me through anything. Yet here he was, hiding behind his wine glass while his mother verbally assaulted me in our own home. I turned away, unable to look at either of them. "I'm going to clear the table," I said, my voice tight with suppressed emotion. I needed to get out of that room before I said something I couldn't take back. As I reached for Cynthia's plate, I heard a sudden movement behind me. Before I could react, a searing pain exploded across my face and arms. I screamed, the world dissolving into chaos and agony. Through the haze of pain, I realized that Cynthia had grabbed the pan of hot oil from the stovetop and hurled its contents at me. I stumbled backwards, knocking plates to the floor. The sound of shattering china seemed distant, overwhelmed by the roaring in my ears and the burning sensation that consumed every inch of my skin. Blindly, I grabbed for a napkin, pressing it against my face in a futile attempt to stop the pain. Through tear-blurred eyes, I looked to James, silently pleading for help, for any sign that he cared. But he just sat there, his face a mask of shock and indecision. Cynthia stood triumphant, her chest heaving as if she'd just won some twisted contest. "Give Marjorie the house," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "Because if not, mark my words, your marriage will end right here, right now." James, still seated, burst out laughing. It wasn't a laughter of joy, there was a nervousness to it, a hint of hysteria. But his silence in the face of this outright attack spoke volumes. The betrayal of his inaction cut me deeper than the oil ever could. As I stood there, my skin blistering and my world crumbling around me, I realized that this moment would change everything. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about dignity, self-respect, and the realization that the family I had married into was toxic to its core. Little did I know, this unforgivable encounter was just the beginning. The choices I would make in the coming days and weeks would reshape my entire life, testing my strength and resilience in ways I never thought possible. But in that moment, all I could feel was the burning of my skin, of my anger, and of the bridges that were about to go up in flames. The world around me blurred into a haze of pain and disbelief. The searing heat on my skin was matched only by the burning rage in my chest. As I stood there, oil dripping from my face and arms, I struggled to process what had just happened. The kitchen, once a place of comfort and creativity, now felt like a battlefield. Cynthia's eyes, dark with malice, bore into me. Her lips curled into a cruel snarl as she hissed, "You ungrateful little witch. You're lucky we tolerate you in this family. Now you're going to ruin Marjorie's move." The words hit me like another splash of hot oil, each syllable burning into my memory. I didn't flinch. Despite the pain, despite the shock, I held my ground. Years of enduring Cynthia's verbal jabs had prepared me for this moment, though I never imagined it would come to physical violence. I glanced at James, desperately seeking support, validation, anything. But what I saw chilled me to my core. James, my husband of 5 years, the man I had built a life with, simply raised his glass as if to toast his mother's tirade. His face was a mask of nervous amusement, a weak chuckle escaping his lips. In that moment, I realized that the betrayal I felt from his inaction was far more painful than any physical wound Cynthia could inflict. "James," I croaked, my voice hoarse from the shock, "aren't you going to say something?" He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Now, Sarah, I'm sure Mom didn't mean to. I mean, it was probably just an accident, right?" His words trailed off as he looked to Cynthia for confirmation. Cynthia's laugh was sharp and humorless. An accident. Please, James. Your wife needs to learn her place in this family. If a little hot oil is what it takes, then so be it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A little hot oil. My skin was blistering, the pain increasing with each passing second. And yet, here was my mother-in-law, justifying her assault as some sort of twisted life lesson. Worse still, my own husband was tacitly approving her actions with his silence. Slowly, carefully, I made my way to the sink. The cool water brought momentary relief as I splashed it over my burns, but I knew this was only a temporary measure. I needed medical attention, and fast. But more than that, I needed to get out of this house, away from these people who had shown their true colors in the most horrific way possible. I'm going to the hospital, I announced, my voice steadier than I felt. Don't follow me. Either of you. James finally stood up, a look of concern crossing his face. Sarah, don't you think you're overreacting? I'm sure it's not as bad as it looks. Why don't you lie down for a bit, and we can talk about this when everyone's calmed down? His words hit me like a slap in the face. Not as bad as it looks. I could feel my skin tightening, the blisters forming. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And yet, here was my husband, trying to downplay the situation, to sweep it under the rug like he did with all of Cynthia's transgressions. No, James, I said, my voice low and controlled. This isn't something we can just talk through. Your mother assaulted me. In our home. And you sat there and did nothing. Cynthia scoffed, tossing her perfectly coiffed hair. Assaulted. Don't be so dramatic, Sarah. This is a family matter, and it will be dealt with as such. There's no need to involve outsiders. I turned to face her, ignoring the pain that shot through my body with every movement. This stopped being just a family matter the moment you decided to throw hot oil at me, Cynthia. You crossed a line, and there's no going back from this. As I grabbed my car keys and headed for the door, I heard James call out weakly, Sarah, please, let's not do anything rash. I paused at the threshold, turning to look at him one last time. The man I saw before me was a stranger. Gone was the confident, loving partner I thought I had married. In his place stood a cowering mama's boy, more concerned with keeping the peace than standing up for what was right. Rash. I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. Rash would be staying here and pretending this never happened. Rash would be forgiving and forgetting, like I've done so many times before. No, James. What I'm doing now isn't rash. It's necessary. With that, I walked out of the house, leaving behind the echoes of Cynthia's smug laughter and James's weak protests. The drive to the hospital was a blur of pain and anger. Tears streamed down my face, mixing with the oil residue and stinging my burns. But I didn't care. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil raging inside me. At the emergency room, the staff sprang into action as soon as they saw my condition. A kind-faced nurse named Elena gently cleaned my burns while a doctor examined the extent of the damage. These are second-degree burns, the doctor said, his brow furrowed with concern. Can you tell me what happened, Mrs. Collins? I hesitated for a moment. Part of me wanted to lie, to say it was a cooking accident. But then I remembered Cynthia's smug face, James's nervous laughter. No, I wouldn't cover for them. Not anymore. My mother-in-law threw a pan of hot oil at me, I said, my voice shaking slightly. During an argument. The doctor and Elena exchanged a look. Mrs. Collins, Elena said gently, would you like us to contact the police? This is a serious assault. I closed my eyes, considering my options. Filing a police report would make this real, irreversible. It would mean the end of my marriage, the end of the life I had built over the past 5 years. But then again, hadn't that life already ended the moment Cynthia raised that pan? Yes, I said finally, opening my eyes. Yes, I want to file a report. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of police statements, photographs of my injuries, and medical treatments. Through it all, my phone remained silent. No calls from James, no messages asking if I was okay. His silence spoke volumes, reinforcing the decision I had made. As I sat on the hospital bed, my arms and face wrapped in bandages, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The pain was still there, both physical and emotional, but it was overshadowed by a newfound resolve. I had spent years trying to fit into Cynthia's world, tiptoeing around her moods and tolerating her jabs. I had watched as James consistently chose the path of least resistance, never standing up to his mother, always expecting me to be the bigger person. But no more. The burns on my skin would heal, leaving scars as a permanent reminder of this day. But they would also serve as a testament to my strength, my refusal to be a victim any longer. As the night deepened and the hospital quieted, I allowed myself to think about the future. It was uncertain, scary even. I would need to find a new place to live, possibly a new job. I would have to navigate the legal system, both for the assault charges and the inevitable divorce. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. I thought about the house, the one Cynthia so callously demanded I give up. It had been my home, filled with dreams of the family James and I might have had. Now, it felt tainted, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Let Marjorie have it, I thought bitterly. Let her see how quickly Cynthia's generosity turns to control. As dawn broke, casting a soft light through the hospital window, I made a promise to myself. I would rebuild my life, on my own terms. I would surround myself with people who respected me, who understood the meaning of love and loyalty. And most importantly, I would never again allow anyone to make me feel small or unworthy. The burns would heal, the pain would fade. But the lessons learned from this betrayal would stay with me forever, guiding me towards a stronger, more authentic version of myself. As I drifted off into an exhausted sleep, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't experienced in a long time: freedom. The soft beeping of hospital machines filled the air as I slowly regained consciousness. For a blissful moment, I forgot where I was and why. Then the pain hit me, a constant, throbbing reminder of yesterday's events. I opened my eyes to the sterile white of a hospital room, the events of the previous day crashing over me like a tidal wave. Gingerly, I touched my face, feeling the rough texture of bandages. The nurse, Elena, entered the room, her kind face a welcome sight in the midst of my turmoil. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," she said softly. "How are you feeling?" I managed a weak smile. "Like I've been to hell and back," I replied, my voice hoarse. Elena nodded sympathetically as she checked my vitals. "The doctor will be in shortly to assess your burns. In the meantime, is there anyone you'd like us to call for you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Who could I call? James. The thought of him made my stomach churn. My parents. They lived on the other side of the country and I couldn't bear the thought of worrying them. Friends. Most of them were mutual friends with James, and I wasn't ready to explain the situation to them. "No," I said finally. "There's no one." Elena's eyes softened with understanding. She patted my hand gently before leaving the room, and I was once again left alone with my thoughts. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I began to take stock of my situation. The physical pain was intense, but it was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil raging inside me. Anger, betrayal, fear, and uncertainty swirled together in a toxic cocktail. But beneath it all, I felt something else stirring, a quiet, steely resolve. I thought of Cynthia's smug face as she threw the oil, of James's nervous laughter and weak attempts at peacemaking. Their actions had shattered the illusion of family I'd been clinging to for years. But in doing so, they'd also freed me from the chains of obligation and misplaced loyalty that had been slowly suffocating me. A plan began to form in my mind. It wasn't fully fleshed out yet, more of a general direction than a detailed roadmap. But it was a start. I would rebuild my life, on my own terms. No more compromising my values to keep the peace. No more shrinking myself to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. The doctor's arrival interrupted my thoughts. He carefully removed the bandages, his face grim as he examined the burns. "The good news is, there's no sign of infection," he said. "But these are serious second-degree burns. They'll take time to heal, and you'll likely have some scarring." I nodded, absorbing the information. Scars. Permanent reminders of this day etched into my skin. But as I thought about it, I realized they could be more than just reminders of pain. They could be badges of survival, proof of my strength and resilience. "What's the recovery process like?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. The doctor explained the treatment plan: regular cleaning and dressing of the wounds, pain management, and follow-up appointments. It would be a long road, but I was determined to walk it. As the day wore on, I had visitors, not the ones I might have expected 24 hours ago, but welcome ones nonetheless. A kind-faced police officer came to take my official statement. A victim's advocate arrived shortly after, armed with resources and support options. "Mrs. Collins," the advocate said gently, "I want you to know that what happened to you is not your fault. You have options, and we're here to support you every step of the way." Her words washed over me, a soothing balm to my battered spirit. For so long, I'd been conditioned to believe that keeping the peace was my responsibility, that any discord in the family was somehow my fault. Hearing someone explicitly state otherwise was more powerful than I could have imagined. As evening approached, I made a decision. With the help of the nurse, I reached for my phone. There were missed calls and messages from James, each one more desperate than the last. I ignored them all, instead pulling up the contact information for a lawyer a friend had recommended ages ago just in case. My fingers hovered over the call button for a moment. Making this call would be irrevocable, the first concrete step towards a new life. I took a deep breath and pressed call. "Law offices of Steiner and Associates, how may I direct your call?" "Yes, hello," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "My name is Sarah Collins. I need to speak with someone about filing for divorce and pressing assault charges against my mother-in-law." The next hour was a blur of legal terms and preliminary advice. By the time I hung up, I had an appointment scheduled for the following week and a list of documents to gather. It was overwhelming, but it also felt right. For the first time since the oil hit my skin, I felt like I was taking control of my life. As night fell and the hospital quieted, I allowed myself a moment of vulnerability. Tears slid down my cheeks, stinging the tender, burned skin. I cried for the life I thought I had, for the future I had planned with James, for the family I had tried so hard to be a part of. But these were cleansing tears, washing away the last vestiges of the person I used to be. When the tears finally stopped, I felt different. Lighter, somehow, as if I'd shed a skin that no longer fit. The pain was still there, both physical and emotional, but it no longer felt all-consuming. Instead, it fueled my determination. I thought about the house, the one Cynthia had so callously demanded I give up. It had been my home, filled with dreams of the family James and I might have had. Now, it felt tainted, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. But it was also an asset, one that I had every right to claim my share of. I made a mental note to discuss it with my lawyer. As I drifted off to sleep, my mind was already racing with plans. I'd need to find a new place to live, somewhere Cynthia and James couldn't find me easily. I'd have to consider my job. Could I continue working at the same place, knowing I might run into James or his friends? Maybe this was the push I needed to finally start that small business I'd always dreamed of. The road ahead would be challenging, there was no doubt about that. But for the first time in years, I felt a sense of excitement about the future. It was uncertain, yes, but it was mine to shape. I woke early the next morning, before the nurses started their rounds. The hospital room was quiet, bathed in the soft light of dawn. I carefully got out of bed, wincing at the pain but determined to stand on my own 2 feet. I made my way to the window, looking out at the city as it began to wake up. Boston stretched out before me, a landscape of possibilities. Somewhere out there was my new life, waiting for me to claim it. As I stood there, I made a silent vow to myself. I would not let this break me. I would not let Cynthia's cruelty or James's cowardice define me. I would rebuild, stronger and wiser than before. And I would do it on my own terms. The burns would heal, leaving scars as a reminder of what I'd endured. But they would also be a testament to my strength, my resilience. Each scar would tell a story, not just of pain and betrayal, but of survival and rebirth. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, I felt a smile tugging at my lips. It was small, and it hurt my damaged skin, but it was real. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt hope. The road ahead would be hard, but I was ready to walk it. My silent resolve had become my armor, my strength, my guiding light. And with it, I would forge a new path, one step at a time. The next few days in the hospital passed in a blur of medical checkups, pain management, and quiet contemplation. By the time I was discharged, my plan had solidified into a series of concrete steps. The hospital staff had been incredibly supportive, providing me with resources for domestic violence survivors and helping me navigate the initial stages of my recovery. As I stepped out of the hospital, I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. The world seemed both familiar and utterly changed. The weight of my decisions pressed heavily on my shoulders, but I stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. My first stop was a small extended-stay hotel on the outskirts of Boston. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, quiet, and most importantly, far from the house I had shared with James. As I settled into my temporary home, I began to take stock of my situation. My phone had been buzzing constantly with messages and missed calls from James and his family. I had ignored them all, but I knew I couldn't avoid them forever. After a moment's hesitation, I blocked their numbers. The silence that followed was both deafening and liberating. The next morning, I woke early, my body still aching but my mind clearer than it had been in days. I had a busy day ahead of me, starting with a visit to my new lawyer, Michael Steiner. The law offices of Steiner and Associates were located in a sleek high-rise in downtown Boston. As I sat in the plush waiting room, I couldn't help but feel out of place. My face and arms were still bandaged, a stark reminder of why I was here. Michael Steiner turned out to be a kind-faced man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a reassuring demeanor. "Mrs. Collins," he greeted me, his voice warm but professional. "I'm so sorry for what you've been through. Let's talk about how we can help you move forward." Over the next 2 hours, we discussed my situation in detail. I recounted the events leading up to Cynthia's attack, my history with James and his family, and my decision to file for divorce and press charges. "Based on what you've told me," Michael said, leaning back in his chair, "we have a strong case for both the divorce and the assault charges. The medical records and police report will be crucial evidence." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. "What about the house?" I asked. "Cynthia was trying to force me to give it up. Do I have any right to it?" Michael's expression turned thoughtful. "The house is marital property, assuming you and James purchased it together during your marriage. You're entitled to your fair share of its value. We'll include that in the divorce proceedings." As we wrapped up our meeting, Michael handed me a thick folder. "These are the initial divorce papers," he explained. "Take some time to review them. We'll file them when you're ready." Leaving the law office, I felt a strange mix of emotions. The reality of my situation was sinking in, but so was the sense that I was taking control of my life. My next stop was a follow-up appointment with Dr. Chen, the burn specialist who had treated me in the hospital. As she carefully examined my healing burns, her expression was cautiously optimistic. "The burns are healing well," she said, gently applying a new dressing. "But I want to start you on a course of physical therapy to prevent long-term mobility issues in your arms." I agreed, adding physical therapy appointments to my growing list of new routines. As I left the clinic, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a window. The bandages were smaller now, revealing patches of angry red skin. I touched my face gently, tracing the outline of what would become scars. They were a map of my pain, but also of my survival. The next item on my agenda was perhaps the most daunting: finding a new job. I had been working as a marketing coordinator for a small firm, but the thought of returning there, of facing the inevitable questions and gossip, made my stomach churn. I spent the afternoon in a small coffee shop, scrolling through job listings on my laptop. As I sipped my latte, an idea began to form. I had always been passionate about graphic design, often taking on freelance projects on the side. What if I turned that passion into a full-time career? Energized by the possibility, I began researching what it would take to start my own graphic design business. It would be challenging, especially given my current situation, but the idea of building something that was entirely my own was incredibly appealing. As evening approached, I made my way back to the hotel. The day had been exhausting, but productive. I felt like I was finally moving forward, each step taking me further from the life I had left behind. Back in my room, I opened my laptop again, this time to check my email. Among the usual clutter was a message that made my heart skip a beat. It was from my best friend from college, Lena, who now lived in New York. "Sarah," the email read, "I just heard what happened. I'm so sorry. I know we haven't talked much lately, but I want you to know I'm here for you. If you need a place to stay or just someone to talk to, I'm a train ride away." Tears welled up in my eyes as I read Lena's words. In the chaos of the past few days, I had forgotten that I wasn't alone. I had friends, people who cared about me outside of my relationship with James. I quickly typed out a response, thanking Lena and promising to call her soon. The next morning, I woke with a renewed sense of purpose. I had a long list of tasks to tackle, researching small business loans, looking into health insurance options, and starting the process of legally changing my name back to my maiden name. As I worked through my to-do list, I found myself thinking about the future in a way I hadn't in years. What did I want my life to look like? Who did I want to be? For so long, I had defined myself in relation to James and his family. Now, I had the chance to rediscover who I was on my own terms. By mid-afternoon, I had made significant progress. I had scheduled appointments with a small business advisor and a financial planner. I had also found a support group for survivors of domestic violence that met weekly at a community center not far from my hotel. As I was about to close my laptop, a notification popped up. It was an email from Michael Steiner. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it. "Sarah," it read, "I wanted to give you a heads up. James has been served with the divorce papers. His lawyer has reached out to discuss terms. Also, the district attorney's office has informed me that they're moving forward with assault charges against Cynthia. They may need you to testify. Let's set up a meeting to discuss next steps." I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long breath. This was it. There was no going back now. The reality of what I was doing, divorcing James, pressing charges against Cynthia, hit me full force. For a moment, I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. But then I thought about that day in the kitchen. I remembered the searing pain of the oil, the sound of James's nervous laughter, the look of smug satisfaction on Cynthia's face. I thought about all the times I had swallowed my anger, made myself smaller to keep the peace. No more. I was done being a victim. I was ready to be the hero of my own story. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my hotel room, I stood by the window, looking out at the city. Somewhere out there, James was reading those divorce papers. Cynthia was probably raging against the assault charges. Their world was being shaken, just as mine had been. But unlike them, I was building something new from the ashes of my old life. It wouldn't be easy. There would be hard days ahead, days when I would question my decisions, when the weight of it all would feel too heavy to bear. But I was ready. Ready to face whatever came next. Ready to rediscover myself, to build a life that was truly my own. As I watched the city lights flicker to life in the gathering dusk, I felt a smile tugging at my lips. For the first time in a long time, I was excited about the future. The plan was in motion. And I was finally, truly, free. The weeks flew by in a whirlwind of activity. My days were filled with lawyer meetings, therapy sessions, and the gradual process of building my new life. The burns on my face and arms were healing, leaving behind scars that were a constant reminder of why I was on this path. Each morning, as I applied the special cream Dr. Chen had prescribed, I reminded myself that these scars were not a mark of victimhood, but a testament to my strength. It was a crisp autumn morning when I received the call I had been both dreading and anticipating. Michael Steiner's voice was calm but tinged with excitement. "Sarah, the DA's office has set a date for Cynthia's arraignment. They want you to be there." My heart raced as I jotted down the details. This was it, the moment when Cynthia would face the consequences of her actions. As I hung up the phone, a mix of emotions washed over me. Fear, anger, anticipation, and underneath it all, a steely determination. The day of the arraignment dawned bright and clear. I stood in front of the mirror, carefully applying makeup to cover the worst of my scars. My reflection showed a woman I was still getting to know, stronger, more determined, with a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The courthouse was an imposing structure of granite and marble. As I climbed the steps, I felt like David approaching Goliath. Michael met me at the entrance, his reassuring presence a balm to my frayed nerves. "Remember," he said quietly as we walked through the metal detectors, "you don't have to say anything today. Just being here sends a powerful message." I nodded, taking a deep breath to steady myself. As we entered the courtroom, my eyes immediately found Cynthia. She sat at the defendant's table, her normally immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw a flicker of something, fear, regret, before her face hardened into a mask of disdain. To my surprise, James was nowhere to be seen. A small part of me had hoped he would be there, that seeing me in person would shake him out of his complacency. But his absence spoke volumes about where his loyalties truly lay. The proceedings began, the judge's gavel echoing through the hushed courtroom. I listened as the charges were read out: assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. The clinical language seemed inadequate to describe the pain and trauma I had endured, but hearing it stated officially, in this formal setting, gave it a weight it hadn't had before. Cynthia pleaded not guilty, her voice strong and defiant. I felt a surge of anger at her continued denial, but I held on to Michael's words. My presence here was enough. I didn't need to speak to be heard. As we left the courthouse, a small group of reporters was waiting. Michael fielded their questions with practiced ease, while I stood silently by his side. One question, however, caught my attention. "Mrs. Collins, how do you respond to claims that this is all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion?" I turned to the young reporter, meeting her eyes squarely. "There's no misunderstanding about assault," I said, my voice steady. "I'm here to ensure that the truth comes out and justice is served." The rest of the day passed in a blur. I returned to my small apartment. I had moved out of the hotel a week ago and tried to process everything that had happened. The arraignment was just the beginning, I knew. There would be more court dates, more confrontations. But I felt ready to face them. The next morning, I woke to a flurry of notifications on my phone. My heart sank as I realized what had happened. Someone, likely one of the reporters, had dug into my past and uncovered the full story. The local news was running with it, painting a picture of a family torn apart by violence and betrayal. I braced myself as I scrolled through the articles. To my surprise, many of them were sympathetic to my cause. There were interviews with domestic violence experts, discussions about the insidious nature of family abuse. My story, it seemed, had struck a chord. As I was making my morning coffee, my phone rang. It was Lena, my college friend. "Sarah," she said, her voice filled with concern, "I just saw the news. Are you okay? Do you need me to come up there?" I felt a rush of gratitude for her friendship. "I'm okay," I assured her. "It's tough, but I'm handling it. Thank you for checking in." We talked for a while longer, Lena offering words of encouragement and support. As I hung up, I realized how much I had missed having people in my corner. James and Cynthia had slowly isolated me over the years, but now I was rebuilding those connections. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. My inbox was flooded with messages, some from old friends offering support, others from strangers sharing their own stories of survival. I felt overwhelmed but also oddly empowered. My voice was being heard, and it was resonating with others. It was nearly a week after the arraignment when it happened. I was returning home from a therapy session, my mind still processing the emotional work we'd done that day. As I turned the corner onto my street, I saw them, 2 police cruisers parked in front of Cynthia's house. My steps faltered as I took in the scene. Officers were leading Cynthia out in handcuffs, her usual poise replaced by a look of shock and indignation. Neighbors were gathering on their lawns, watching the spectacle unfold. For a moment, I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. Then, almost without realizing it, I found myself walking towards the commotion. As I got closer, I could hear Cynthia's voice, shrill with panic. "This is ridiculous. Do you know who I am? I'll have your badges for this." One of the officers, a kind-faced woman, noticed me approaching. "Mrs. Collins," she said quietly. "We have a warrant for Mrs. Henderson's arrest. The DA's office has decided to pursue felony charges based on new evidence." I nodded, unable to form words. The officer gave me a sympathetic smile before turning back to her task. As they led Cynthia to the cruiser, her eyes locked onto mine. For a brief moment, I saw the mask slip, revealing the fear and desperation underneath. Then James appeared, rushing out of the house. His eyes were wild as he took in the scene, darting between Cynthia and me. "Sarah," he said, his voice pleading, "what's going on? Can't you stop this?" I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since that day in the kitchen. The man I had loved, the man I had built a life with, suddenly seemed small and pathetic. "No, James," I said, my voice steady. "I can't stop this. And I wouldn't if I could. This is justice." As the police cars drove away, their sirens piercing the quiet suburban afternoon, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't over, there would be trials and testimonies to come. But in that moment, watching Cynthia being driven away to face the consequences of her actions, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. I turned away from the scene, ignoring James's continued pleas. As I walked back to my apartment, I felt lighter, stronger. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but I was ready to walk it. Justice had come knocking, and I had answered the door. That evening, as I sat in my small but cozy living room, I reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The woman I was just a few months ago would never have believed she could stand up to Cynthia, let alone see her arrested. But here I was, not just surviving, but thriving. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Great news," it read. "With the felony charges, we have a strong case for both the criminal trial and your divorce proceedings. You're in a good position, Sarah." I smiled, feeling a sense of vindication. The path to healing was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hope for the future. Justice was being served, and I was reclaiming my life, one day at a time. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but I was ready to face them. The scars on my skin were healing, and so was my spirit. Cynthia's actions had been meant to break me, but instead, they had forged me into something stronger. Justice was at my door, and I had welcomed it with open arms. The months following Cynthia's arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, therapy sessions, and personal growth. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities for me to reclaim the power I had lost during my years with James and his family. One crisp autumn morning, I found myself sitting across from James in a mediator's office. The divorce proceedings had reached their final stages, and we were here to hammer out the last details. James looked haggard, the strain of the past few months evident in the dark circles under his eyes and the new lines on his face. "Sarah," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "are you sure about this? We could still work things out." I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in months. The man I had once loved, the man I had built my life around, now seemed small and pitiful. I felt a twinge of sadness, not for what I was losing, but for what I had endured for so long. "No, James," I replied, my voice steady and calm. "There's no going back. Not after everything that's happened." The mediator, a kind-faced woman named Linda, guided us through the process. We discussed the division of assets, including the house that had been the catalyst for so much pain. In the end, we agreed that it would be sold, with the proceeds split between us. As we signed the final papers, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This chapter of my life was closing, but a new one was just beginning. I walked out of the office feeling lighter than I had in years. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. I threw myself into building my new life with a fervor that surprised even me. My fledgling graphic design business was starting to take off, with a steady stream of clients keeping me busy. Each project was a chance to flex my creative muscles, to prove to myself that I was capable of standing on my own 2 feet. One Saturday afternoon, as I was working on a logo design for a local bakery, my phone buzzed with a text from Lena. "Turn on the news," it read. Channel 5. Curious, I flipped on the TV. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Cynthia's face filling the screen. The ticker at the bottom read, Local socialite pleads guilty to assault charges. I turned up the volume, listening intently as the news anchor detailed the plea deal Cynthia had accepted. She would serve time in prison, followed by a lengthy probation period. The anchor went on to praise the DA's office for their handling of the case, citing it as a landmark victory in the fight against domestic violence. As the segment ended, I sat back, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. There was relief, certainly, that Cynthia would face consequences for her actions. But there was also a strange sense of pity. Cynthia, for all her faults, was a product of a society that too often turned a blind eye to abuse within families. Her downfall was a stark reminder of the need for change. The next day, I received a call from Michael, my lawyer. "Sarah," he said, his voice warm with congratulations, "I just heard about Cynthia's plea deal. This is a big win for us. How are you feeling?" I paused, considering the question. "Honestly, I'm feeling empowered," I replied. For so long, I felt like I had no control over my life. But now I'm calling the shots. Michael chuckled. "That's what I like to hear. Listen, there's something else we need to discuss. With Cynthia's conviction, we have a strong case for a civil suit. We could potentially recover damages for your medical expenses, lost wages, pain, and suffering." I listened as Michael laid out the details, weighing my options carefully. Part of me wanted to put this all behind me, to focus on moving forward. But another part, the part that still woke up in cold sweats some nights, remembering the searing pain of the oil, wanted to see this through to the end. "Let's do it," I said finally. "Not for the money, but to send a message. This kind of behavior can't be tolerated." The civil suit process was grueling. I had to relive the attack in excruciating detail, describing every moment to a room full of lawyers and jury members. But with each retelling, I felt the power of my own voice growing stronger. As the trial progressed, I was surprised to find myself in the spotlight once again. Local media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a David and Goliath battle against domestic violence. I received messages of support from all over the country, from other survivors who saw their own struggles reflected in mine. One evening, as I was preparing for another day in court, I received an unexpected visitor. It was James, looking more disheveled than ever. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracking, I'm sorry. For everything. I should have protected you. I should have stood up to my mother. Can you ever forgive me?" I looked at him, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There was anger, certainly, and hurt. But there was also pity, and a strange sense of gratitude. Without realizing it, James had given me the push I needed to reclaim my life. "I forgive you, James," I said softly. "Not for your sake, but for mine. I can't carry this anger anymore. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. We can't go back to how things were." James nodded, tears streaming down his face. As he turned to leave, I felt a chapter of my life truly close. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities. The civil trial concluded a few weeks later. The jury found in my favor, awarding me a substantial sum in damages. As I left the courthouse for the final time, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I was missing. That evening, I sat in my new apartment, surrounded by the life I had built for myself. My walls were adorned with my own artwork, a tangible reminder of how far I'd come. On my desk sat a stack of business cards for my thriving graphic design company, each one a testament to my newfound independence. I opened my laptop, navigating to the website I had been working on in secret for weeks. It was a resource for survivors of domestic violence, filled with information, support hotlines, and stories of hope. My story was there too, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a beacon of resilience. As I hit publish, sending the site live, I felt a surge of emotion. This was my way of turning my pain into purpose, of using my experience to help others who might be trapped in similar situations. The next morning, I woke early, eager to start my day. As I applied my makeup, carefully covering the fading scars on my face, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was strong, confident, and unafraid. She had been through hell and come out the other side, not just surviving, but thriving. I thought back to that day in the kitchen, when Cynthia had thrown the oil at me. She had meant to break me, to keep me under her control. Instead, she had inadvertently set me free. The scars on my skin were a map of my journey, each one a reminder of the strength I had found within myself. As I left my apartment, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had reclaimed my power, my voice, my life. The road hadn't been easy, and I knew there would be more obstacles ahead. But I was ready for them. I was no longer the woman who let others define her worth. I was Sarah Collins, survivor, entrepreneur, advocate. The sun was rising over Boston as I walked to my office, casting a golden glow over the city. It felt like a new dawn, not just for the day, but for my life. I had faced my demons, stood up to my abusers, and come out stronger on the other side. As I unlocked the door to my office, I smiled to myself. This was just the beginning. I had reclaimed my power, and I was ready to use it to build the life I deserved, on my own terms. The future was bright, and for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to see what it held.